good afternoon to all participants. First of all, let me express on behalf of the government of the Netherlands our sincere gratitude to the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO and DG Mare of the European Commission to give us this opportunity to share with you our views and experiences with maritime spatial planning within the country and in the wider setting of the North Sea. We are supportive of the joint work undertaken in the Marine Spatial Planning Global Project to bring together evidence and input from over the world to develop guidance on MSP, which can be used to achieve global ambitions related to oceans, seas, and coast. I think it's necessary for the sake of the living environment, climate proofing of the world we live in, for a sustainable blue economy, and leaving no one behind. In order for us to achieve these global ambitions together, the area at sea have multiple challenges and functions. It's not only about the better condition of the seas, the restoring of the ecosystem, and preserving the biodiversity for generations to come. The sea is also an area where we need to allow human activities to mitigate climate change through offshore renewable energy techniques, and as the blue part of the global economy, for sustainable food, transport, telecommunication, and certainly in the case of the Netherlands, protection from the sea and adaptation to sea level rise. Life below water has a strong focus on the ocean and seas, which is important in its own. But for us Dutch, it means a little more than that alone, since half of our country and population live below the sea level. And so we have a long history in working with water and also trying to keep it out. In our attempt to keep the country secure from flooding, we have created a flood defense system with traditional dikes, but also an extensive system with flexible flood barriers and storm surges. The downside of all these engineering construction is a negative impact on ecology. For instance, for migratory species using both salt and fresh water. Nowadays, we work from a concept we call building with nature, or if you like, nature-based solutions. And we use, where we can, sandy dune systems and geomorphological processes and also wind erosion. Another example of nature-based solutions is, for example, the fish migration river in the IJssel lake dike. We have, I think, been a strong advocate of the concept of land-sea interactions as part of the Maritime Spatial Planning in the Directive on the MSP of the European Union. It's not because we disregard integrated coastal zone management as a useful policy and management process, but because thinking in terms of land-sea interactions allows us to involve more aspects of life on land with the sea. From addressing pollution at the source to transport of goods and services from and on the oceans to communities inland. Maritime spatial planning started to be a topic on political level, I think in the beginning of the century, when politicians began to worry about the triple-fold function of the sea as being the largest natural environment we have, where fishing takes place almost everywhere, and there are new human uses like wind farms. So it made it necessary to think about defining a certain type of spatial zoning. Today, it's our pleasure to take you a bit back in time in our marine spatial planning history. The policy philosophy, our national priorities and working methods, but also how we see international cooperation in our sea basin function. And today we will inform you about the intense 4 years we have been through with redefining our spatial policy for the North Sea in the years to come. It's an intense period with heated debate and negotiations amongst government organizations, with political discussions on governance, with our fishery sectors, green NGOs, and all the other main players from ports and offshore wind. So we take this opportunity to reflect with you on what has happened at the negotiation table and how we came out of it so far. Maritime spatial planning, it's a politically guided process with strong input from stakeholders. And what that means will become clear, I think, in the second part of our presentation. It's presented by Tina Kelder, our project leader for the Marine Spatial Planning Program, and which is published for national and international consultation only last Monday. I thank you again. I'm looking forward to the international guidelines on MSP later this year, and thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, all of you, ladies and gentlemen. And a special warm welcome back to our loyal followers of MSP in the Netherlands. But the ones who've never seen this presentation, you're absolutely welcome to take note. And let's see if we can get this going off in a bit of a sprint type of method. Next, please. Here you see what we have structured for you today. Like Liz van Duin said, we want to go through a little bit of our policy philosophy for ecosystem-based maritime spatial planning, or maritime spatial development, if you like. Take you a bit back into history, the policy structure, how does our government foresee that we undertake this work, and we'll dive in a bit of the international cooperation, a busy sea shared by at least 8 countries, some say 9, with all different languages. And then my colleague Tina, she will take over and take you through the part 4 of this presentation on the latest developments, and trying to give you a bit of a flavor, if you like, of what it is to be in the midst of a hefty negotiation process. Then at the end, we'll be looking ahead what's on our plate to further work on. Next, please. Give you some facts and figures. I'm not gonna read through all the text, so bear with me a little bit. Roughly 600,000 square kilometers, this large marine ecosystem, which is the North Sea. It's complex because of it being a shallow system. We have over 1,200 marine species in the North Sea, all of course being in relation to one another. And by now we have established 6 marine protected areas, nearing up to almost 20% of the little area. A tenth of the North Sea is ours. And we have 3 more marine protected areas in the policy pipeline to be able to move towards the 30%, which is under negotiation globally and already accepted within the EU. Next. So the Netherlands has quite a few ports, and Rotterdam may be well known to you all. North Sea ports has been created on the southern side of the Netherlands, and of course we have Amsterdam as well. These 3 ports accommodate vessels up to 400 meters, in particular Rotterdam. North Sea ports in Amsterdam can handle ships with a length of 300 meters, of course, which we take into account when looking at maritime spatial planning from a safety perspective. This also shows you how the sea is being used by all other users, and it in particularly is challenging to find enough areas for offshore wind. Next. So then, the philosophy and a bit of science for system-based maritime spatial planning. Next. The real understanding of what maritime spatial planning is in our view, a governance issue. Yes, we have to look at the sea. Yes, we have to look at space. We have to look at time. We have to look at what's above the water, what's on top of the water, what's below the water, and what's in the seabed. But it all comes down as a process which is and needs to be politically guided, hence with a mandate from Parliament to work on. And of course, it's stakeholder driven. That's why we do it. As a government, we don't take all the activities. A functional large marine ecosystem should be, in our view, the base of working in and at and with the sea. UNCLOS and regulations, agreements in IMO are a base for our national maritime spatial plan. So as are the Sustainable Development Goals, of which life below water, of course, stands out, but don't forget zero hunger, climate action, and clean energy in order for us to reduce the acidity of the sea if possible. And the connection to land and water systems in planning, one will find in SDG 15. And of course, climate proofing our cities is an important aspect of the work we undertake. EU legislation, we will go into it a little bit later, drives a lot of our targets, which we have to deliver either by ourselves or in the context of the countries of the North Sea. Stakeholders, they deserve to be at the same level of information, and it's always challenging to get an open discussion and have everybody talk in the same way, or at least understand one another. The little silos we still have, they all come with their own language, and that's in maritime spatial planning sometimes a challenge. We aim for processes for decision making to have it done in one term of government. That is the most stable way we find to do planning. If you go across elections, you wait for formation for a new government, and perhaps that has new or different ideas, and that might stall the process and also stall or hinder delivering on the targets we've just gone through. Joint research on cumulative effects of human uses and ecosystems, I think a challenge for all of us globally, and in particular if you are working with quite a few human pressures at the sea. But we need to be pragmatic when need be. The joint language is something which is not set at the outset. It's also something which is dynamically developing, like we talk maritime spatial planning or development. International cooperation, that's also within the setting of the EU, requires the respect of different government systems. And some of you might have also seen how our German neighbors are doing their maritime spatial planning. They do it slightly different, but that's a matter of resolving that from bottom up. Be a trusted partner, that's what we try to do, and we think that comes back later on in a maritime spatial planning process. Next, please. So, summarizing this a little bit, let's think big, think about the entire sea. That's what species at sea use. Let's think long term. The Paris Agreement takes up to 2050, and we have to start developing right now to reach the end goal we have in mind. Thinking systems, not only ecological systems, but also human systems, logistical systems, and how these elements interact. Thinks human who live on land, and particularly, of course, the sea area is used by seafarers and people working offshore. marine biologists might go there, but it's a whole different thing than people even as close by as a couple of kilometers from the coast. They might have be completely different views and only take what is coming from the sea, but perhaps even not knowing how this all works. We have a principle of development by design, which allows us a bit of flexibility when going through not only the process, but also in creating new ways of working with the sea. Of course, thinking spatial and starting to see. That's why on the picture shown, you see the Netherlands from north and not from south. Next, please, Alejandro. Hugo Grotius developed the concept of freedom of the seas in 1609. And when I came on board in 2010, after 400 years, we with Maritime Spatial Planning said a little bit goodbye to his thinking. Not in the basics, but hence a little bit of history. Next. So the Mare Liberum, followed by establishing the borders of the continental shelf, which also in our case in the North Sea took a couple of years, discussing with our Belgian colleagues and the English neighbors and the German neighbors. It all took a while. And then when UNCLOS was adopted in the 80s, it took us quite a bit of time to establish also the EEZ, though it has the same external limits. Then moving from the common fisheries policy in Europe, we developed a sectoral licensing system for activities at sea. First come, first served. People had a project in mind. They applied with our management organization, Rijkswaterstaat. They looked at, would it fit? Would it be balancing interests? Would it be not negative on the marine environment, but in a non-structured way in terms of thinking, what is this space we have at sea and how should we best use it? And that we saw when we first started tendering for a couple of wind farms in 2007, 2008. Then there were a lot of applications also for wind farms in the shipping lanes, moving to the ports, competing claims, claims for wind farms on areas where you would not find the best conditions, and it led to a lot of court cases. So then, together with the thinking already developing in Parliament, our management organization said this is a policy document. This is a policy we need to develop. This needs to be politically guided. Then in 2008, we established our first full maritime spatial plan, which was prior to the European directive. Then on the right side of this slide, you see that we have gone through ever since working on MSP day in, day out, publishing documents, revised documents, a strategy for 2050 or an agenda at least. And well, this you can all read back from a publication made by Leo de Vrees in 2019. Next, please. So what did it look like? The plan of 2009, like this. And there were quite a few things which are as they are and are still the same. The shipping lanes, more or less, further defined. The environmental protection areas were identified. Search areas for offshore wind were already mapped. Sand extraction areas. So this is what we have been working with ever since. Next. Combining that picture of our maritime spatial plan with those of the neighbors results in this picture from 2011, where we see potentially conflicts. If you really dig into it, you notice that areas are colored by various governments to communicate what's important to them. And so this does not mean, this picture, that there's a conflict. The blue area on the UK side on the left with our Dogger Bank area, which we try to protect. The English also have protection schemes there. And offshore wind is not in conflict necessarily with protecting of habitats. We have a shallow sandy area. So only when they come into an area where we have bird protection, then that might be an issue. Next, please. To overcome this and to look more holistically, we made this agenda for 2050. Also stepping out of discussions what to do in the next 5 to 10 years, see where can we find synergies and how should we, well, some people would say call it a vision, but at least for us it was clear that having the overarching idea what's going out there, what needs to be done, what can be done, what might we discover along the way of rolling out this work with the sea. That's actually what this was all about, this agenda. Building with nature for us was a very important one to discover, because nature and fisheries activities or marine food activities do not necessarily compete. They might in the short run, but in the long run, we want to have a balanced, biodiverse sea, which is healthy and also provides food for not only people in the Netherlands, but worldwide. Next, please. A couple of maps again, which only indicate that from time to time you dive into a little bit more specifics, always within the bigger, the context of the bigger picture. The offshore wind roadmaps have helped us a lot to communicate what are the plans of the government to the industry. We make the strategic environmental assessment, and this roadmap has allowed us to come to offshore wind, which does not need any subsidies. Next, please. Now, how are we structured? Next. Like many countries, we have quite a few ministries working on elements which have to do with the sea. We are, as the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, the coordinating minister. This is not a coordination from top down, but bottom up, if you like. Liz van Duin, our director, she is chairing this board of directors from the North Sea. We work for a cabinet, and of course we have the House of Representatives controlling what the cabinet is doing. Next, please. So our Maritime Spatial Plan is not a single loose standing document. Actually, it's part of our national water plan, or water program nowadays, which we make every 6 years, also to work with the freshwater bodies and the transitional waters, coastal waters. And the Maritime Spatial Plan is a independent annex, or you can read it independently, it's an annex, part of that national water plan. Why? Because on land we have multi-level governance with provinces, with the water boards, with municipalities, but the sea is under national jurisdiction. So only the national government is the one taking the decisions on which activities are allowed and what are not allowed from 1 kilometer from the coast. Next, please. So we have established quite a few high over targets, which we need to see, look at in our MSP adventures. They're the national priorities, and they proceed over other elements. Here on the picture, you see sand extraction. We have a strategy till 2100. So we know exactly or roughly hopefully, where to get the sand to use for supplementing on the coastline. Ports, shipping, energy production, military exercise, harvesting of sustainable food, and the best use of available space are the priorities we work with. Next. Then we have a assessment framework for consenting, which is part of the Maritime Spatial Plan and is communicating to stakeholders what are the steps when consenting. So where the spatial claim, then we look at does this fit with the precautionary principle? Do we have enough information to allow such a thing, not to harm the environment? Then we select a location. We have to go back to the national interest to see if it fits. If there need be a mitigation of effects, then that's stipulated. And if mitigation is not possible, then we look at compensating. Marine protected areas is a whole different story. We design where they need to be, of course, based on the best available evidence and stakeholder discussions. And then a defined management plan is made by our management organization. Next. We are changing a bit of our legal structure because we still have a Water Act, a Spatial Act, and almost 7 or 8 different acts which steer how we can plan and consent the sea. This is a process taking a long time, and the new act will get into force in 2022, but we already worked through with the principles of that piece of legislation. Next, please. With that new all-over Planning and Environment Act, a national strategy was developed, also indicating once again what are our priorities. The main aim of this new vision, as we call it, is the spatial quality combined with the quality of the environment. Next, please. International cooperation. We always talk about it. It's not easy to do. Next. We have, luckily, things which bind us all within the EU, and quite a few elements of what we do in the North Sea are also independently supported by the UK as part of our work in the Regional Seas Convention, OSPAR, or because from a planning conservation point of view, they follow the same ideas as we. The Green Deal, you might have heard of it already, from 2019, which is taking us in the EU to sustainable future. Biodiversity strategy has been released and adopted by the member states. An offshore renewable strategy, idem, and a blue economy strategy is forthcoming. We expect it in a couple of weeks' time. And they all form the new targets for maritime spatial planning. Next, please. Bit of work we done scientifically together with the working group in ICES is to understand if we as a country in the Netherlands do something, let's say we build wind farms. So what's going on? You have to go out at sea, you have to place these turbines, and then you have also maintain and perhaps replace those turbines in a couple of years' time. So we see a lot of movements. It's not only going once, it's going back and forth all the time. And this might have consequences for birds who we don't protect under our own legislation because we don't have a colony of such a bird, but that those birds might be somewhere else located with their colonies, and they either fly or swim to our waters in various times of the year. So thinking about doing something in one area of the sea, where might it have consequences and where might you see the evidence of such consequences is a system we've been thinking through and also using to make a cumulative assessment framework. Next, please. So how do we do this? Through strategic cooperation since long time in the Regional Seas Convention. We have projects either started and paid by ourselves or within the EU framework with support of the EU, like the strategic environmental assessment work we've been doing, all work on shipping, ecology, and energy, which we see as transboundary elements in MSP to work on. And we have a politically agreed cooperation for offshore wind energy. In the little sea we expect over 200 gigawatt of offshore wind to be needed to meet our climate neutrality goals. Next, please. Well, Tina, it's up to you to take us through. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. About the, I will tell you something about the MSP policy process. Next slide, please. By the end of 2016, national government initiated the development of a strategic agenda for the North Sea in 2030. In cooperation with stakeholders, many planning issues were identified. I have listed a few here. Offshore wind energy was taking off. The marine environment needed protection and restoration. We have a struggling fisheries sector. Shipping is taking place, and we were exploring new opportunities such as seaweed cultivation and the co-use of wind farms. And each of these challenges involve several stakeholders and often significant interests. Next, please. This agenda for the North Sea in 2030 was to guide concrete political choices in the period 2022-2027. A joint working process was drafted to guide maritime planning from 2017 to 2020. So in this way, discussions would start in good time. This would allow a new government that was elected in spring 2017 to govern each policy step. And central to this working process was to identify which are the key players and what are the key challenges to consider, as these were rather numerous. Next, please. In this light, the Minister of Infrastructure and Water Management sought advice from the Dutch Physical Environment Consultative Council. This council is independent and exists to help sort out many faceted planning issues. The central question was how to develop broad support for a strategic agenda for North Sea policy, because the stakeholders are so numerous and the challenges are also there are so many challenges. The goal of the advice was to facilitate a lasting cooperation for the policy directions we would choose, as well as lasting support for management of the North Sea. And this advice was sought in a context of existing tensions between different activities and functions. For instance, between nature, sand extraction, fisheries, and shipping, there were already differing views on how to what the policy direction should be. But a main driver on the North Sea was considered to be the expected and substantial increase in offshore wind energy. to meet EU goals as well as the Paris Agreement. And this significant increase in new use on the sea necessitates careful consideration on a long-term horizon. Next, please. Let's see. According to the subsequent analysis by this consultative council, stakeholders are well aware of their diverging interests and also of diverging policy goals from different national departments. Secondly, they perceive the route to a joint policy framework impaired by an imperfect weighing of interests. So that's to say silo thinking by the departments. Thirdly, stakeholders expressed a wish for a more directive national government, as well as a more meaningful role for individual stakeholders in the policy formulation that was to come. And finally, the Consultative Council noticed a call for joint policy making instead of the more traditional way of participation through commenting on more or less finalized texts. To make this step from participation to consultation really requires a big step in the way we work together with stakeholders. The advice resulting from this analysis was to conclude a North Sea agreement between national governments and the prime stakeholders through a North Sea Council with an independent chair. So that was a proposal for a step change in the usual government-led interactions with stakeholders. The other advice was to focus on the triangle between nature, sustainable energy, and the fisheries sector, because any decisions in these areas is strongly linked to, it has strong effects on the other two policy areas. Next slide, please. The advice to conclude a North Sea agreement was fully accepted in February 2019. The process to conclude this agreement was meant to take about 6 months, but it took 2 years in the end, with adoption in Parliament in January 2021. It was really an intensive process on the administrative level, so quite high level officers were involved, and also with a high level representation from NGOs, the energy sector, fisheries, shipping and harbors, and also national government, of course. Meetings took place and actually still do, they take place every month, and in some instances even more often when specific themes turned up that needed further discussions. This schedule led to intensive cooperation between all the departments involved that Lodewijk already mentioned, which are quite a few. And in these discussions, national government was to voice one coordinated position. And Liz van Duin, you just met here, coordinated the effort to come to one position. It has resulted in very valuable networks between the departments. These meetings of the North Sea Council also enabled joint fact-finding on interdependent issues, so that any views could be considered and could potentially be part of the facts on which policy would later be based. And finally, the rules of procedure of this North Sea Council provided a safe setting for all participants to discuss positions openly and in a way that would lead to a deeper understanding of positions and maybe possibilities to meet each other somewhere halfway. Well, the result is that we now have a North Sea agreement which provides support for interlinked policy directions for offshore wind energy areas, nature conservation areas, oil and gas extraction that should be limited to national consumption, an area-based approach to co-use of wind farms, and a 200 million euro transition means. These 200 million euros are meant to feed new research, additional enforcement for new measures at sea, and a sustainable fisheries fleet. This North Sea Council that was actually instated to conclude the North Sea Agreement will be a permanent feature and a new way of governing on the North Sea, new way of governance. Well, unfortunately, the fisheries representatives were not able to support the final North Sea Agreement. Mediation is still in progress, as was requested by the end of January also by our parliament. Yeah, next slide, please. Well, I already told you about the North Sea Agreement being adopted. You here see a picture, going those extra miles for a healthy North Sea. We are currently drawing up an implementation agenda to work towards implementation of this agreement in 2030. And in 2023, we will have a review of progress and a review of the experiences with this new type of governance through the North Sea Council. The spatial elements of the North Sea Agreement have been the basis for actual policy development in the framework of the North Sea Programme 2022-2027, which is the Dutch MSP plan. Next slide, please. Oh, it's not only the next slide, it's the next section on the North Sea Programme. So next slide, please. Well, the Dutch MSP plan is a self-binding policy document for national government for spatial development. So we make clear where we will do what. The spatial elements of the North Sea Agreement I was just referring to are mainly connected to offshore wind area, nature conservation, shipping lanes, area passports, which tell you something about possibilities for co-use in wind farms, the sustainable blue economy. Land-sea interactions are not connected to the North Sea Agreement, but they are an important issue in relation to the EU MSP directive. The North Sea Programme planning process is broader than the triangle the North Sea Agreement addresses, so broader than only nature, energy, and fisheries. The North Sea Programme also includes policy on the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, so really environment only, sand extractions, cables, recreation, and cultural heritage at sea. The making of a strategic environmental assessment is an integral part of our planning process. In that way, we can make clear how environmental issues were addressed in the policy choices we propose. Next slide, please. Here you can see 3 of the resulting maps. The first one shows the current users. It says 2019, but it's 2020 actually. The second map in the middle shows the marine protected areas and areas proposed for fishery management. So we will try to keep the seabed from being from receiving too many fishery activities there. And finally, you see a map including all the planning elements in the North Sea Programme. So you can see the dots are where we can have sand extraction. You can see the shipping lanes, nature areas. The red areas are where we have our current wind farms. Next slide, please. The North Sea Programme is the first product really to put the new consultative working method into practice. Policy texts have been developed in many working groups with stakeholders. Based on this, discussion papers were developed to discuss policy choices with the North Sea Council at an early stage. And in the end, the North Sea Council could discuss if the North Sea Agreement was translated in a satisfactory way into the actual policy that the North Sea program embodies. This requires a continuous effort from us to discuss policy options at an early stage. And it is still our instinct to work out too much already before contacting our stakeholders. And Lies van Duin, who introduced us, has taken it upon herself to fully implement this new working culture throughout national government. We also had informal meetings with our neighboring countries, Denmark, Germany, Belgium, and the UK. And we are still having follow-up meetings on several relevant topics, such as shipping, but also seaweed production. Next slide, please. All right. Oh, this is a bit of change. So we have 3 elements as a basis for our MSP policy and decision making the coming years. We have this North Sea Agreement. We have the North Sea Council and the North Sea program. I should add that the North Sea Council gives advice on which policy proposals to follow, and it's not a decision-making body. Well, we are in the middle of this whole planning process, and we are trying to unbox the decision-making we are going through. And finally, last week we had national elections, and this will also lead to new focus areas, new accents, and further joint discussions. So next slide, please. Well, Lodewijk already told you, but the North Sea program has been developed as part of the National Water Plan, and this plan regards all waters under national management. Consultation of the plan is open from last Monday, the 22nd of March, until the 21st of September. Based on the strategic environmental assessment, an independent commission for environmental assessment will advise our minister on the way environmental topics and have been included in the policy plans. And formal international cross-border consultation will take place through the ESPO network. And formal adoption of the North Sea program is foreseen, or actually, expected in March 2022. So about a year from now. Next slide, please. We have not yet realized all policy ambitions in the current draft for the North Sea program. The designation of offshore wind areas requires further research on ecology. For now, we have designated search areas for offshore wind, and the map you see here has been included in the draft for the North Sea program. We aspire to prepare together with stakeholders and in the context of discussions in the North Sea Council a decision on which of these areas to use up until 2030. We are trying to do this in the coming 6 months. So this is a bit of it's a new situation also for us in the planning process. Our draft North Sea program is already in consultation since last Monday, and is containing these areas for offshore wind. But we will in the coming months try to designate a subset and then include it in the current public participation that is taking place. Okay, next slide. Yeah, here Lodewijk, this was it for me on the planning process, and Lodewijk will tell you something more on the digital twin that is being made of the North Sea.
Yes, thank you, Tina. The technicians are seeing if they can start my video, if I'm allowed. But here we've been looking for to see if we can get all data and information which is available not only for our part of the North Sea, but for the entire North Sea. We can bring that together and connect spatial design module with the ecological models, and to run simulations, whether it be on safety of shipping, on cumulative impacts on marine species, but also loading in conditions like wind to establish the best possible areas. We take into account also the flight paths. Part of our North Sea area is in fact the approach to London Heathrow and the other airports around London. So many data layers, and roughly we calculate 5,000 of them, could all be combined and also supported with what we call a wiki, which gives you information on all the relevant aspects in ecosystem-based maritime spatial planning, whether it be on marine species, whether it be on importance for local communities or in terms of the national budget. We plan to bring all that together and also to start visualizing the sea, whether that be in virtual reality, shown above on this slide, or in augmented reality. And my dream would be that one day we can use holograms and display our maritime spatial plan like that, both for stakeholders and in Parliament. Thank you very much. Next slide. Thank you. Merci. Gracias. All of our relevant documents which have been established are to be found through our website.